Zephyr Santoro had killed men for less than a lie, but when his father hugged a total stranger and called her wife, the most dangerous man in Italy found himself unable to pull the trigger. The chandelier light in the grand ballroom was crystalline and unforgiving, designed to highlight the sparkle of diamonds and the sharp creases of $1,000 tuxedos. Callista Varelli moved through the crowd like a drop of ink in clear water, her red silk dress a defiant contrast to the sea of muted grays and blacks. She was a woman who lived by the rule of invisibility, yet tonight she had chosen to be a flame. She only needed 5 minutes, one hand off, one envelope, and then she would slip back into the shadows of the city. But the Santoro Gala was not a place where one simply slipped away. Zephyr Santoro stood near the mahogany bar, the undisputed son of this dark solar system. His hand rested on his chin, his intense eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a predator. He was calculating the loyalty of his capos and the interest on his debts, his short-styled hair catching the amber glow of the room. To his left, a bodyguard stood like a statue, a reminder that in this house even the air was guarded. Then the music stopped, not because the orchestra had finished, but because the patriarch had moved. Orsino Santoro, the silver-haired lion whose name still commanded a terrifying reverence, had been seated in a velvet armchair, surrounded by his inner circle. Suddenly, he rose. His movements were frantic, his deep-set wrinkles twitching with a sudden, violent surge of emotion. He pushed past his son, his eyes locked onto the woman in red. "Elena!" Orsino's voice cracked, a sound so raw it felt like a physical wound in the silent room. Callista froze. She saw the flash of the bodyguard's hand reaching for a holster. She saw Zephyr's expression shift from boredom to a sharp, lethal confusion. Before she could retreat, Orsino was there. His hands, weathered and trembling, caught her shoulders with surprising strength. He didn't look at her like a stranger. He looked at her like a man seeing a miracle. "Elena, you've come home," Orsino choked out, tears spilling over as he pulled her into a protective, desperate embrace. I told them you wouldn't leave me in the rain." The silence in the ballroom became suffocating. 100 pairs of eyes settled on Callista. She could feel the heat of Orsino's grief. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint smell of old paper. Over the old man's shoulder, her eyes met Zephyr's. The Mafia boss was no longer watching the room. He was watching her. His gaze was a cold interrogation, a silent promise of fire and steel. He didn't see a miracle. He saw a breach in his fortress. The scene was set, the scandal was public, and as Orsino sobbed into her neck, Callista realized the doors were already locked. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a ghost. The transition from the velvet warmth of the ballroom to the cold, clinical silence of the Santoro mansion was as swift as a blade's edge. Callista was not escorted. She was steered. The men in black suits moved with a practiced fluidity, keeping her centered in a moving box of muscle until the soundproof doors of a private study clicked shut behind her. The room was a study in monochromatic power, gray stone walls, charcoal upholstery, and the smell of expensive tobacco and ozone. Zephyr Santoro did not sit. He moved to the center of the room, his presence expanding to fill every shadow. He looked at Callista, not as a woman, but as a puzzle he intended to break. "Sit," he commanded. The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Callista sat in the high-backed chair, her red dress looking like a fresh spill against the gray fabric. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Zephyr leaned over her, his hands gripping the arms of her chair, caging her. His face was inches from hers, close enough for her to see the flecks of amber in his dark, suspicious eyes. "I don't know what game you're playing," he hissed, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "I don't know if you're a gift from the Morettis or a particularly bold grifter who studied my mother's old portraits. But let me be clear, my father is fragile, not stupid, and I am neither." "I didn't seek him out," Callista said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He came to me. I don't even know who Elena is." Zephyr's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "You don't speak her name. You don't even think it." He straightened up, pacing the rug like a caged wolf. "My father is the son of this family. If he collapses, the system collapses. Outside that door, he is telling the consigliere that his wife has returned from the dead. Because of you, I have a dozen capos wondering if the Santoro bloodline has gone soft." He stopped and looked at a security monitor on the wall. Orsino was visible in the hallway, his face lit with a terrifying, radiant hope as he spoke to a guard. Zephyr turned back to Callista, his expression hardening into something final. "You aren't leaving," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "You will stay in this house. You will eat when I say, you will sleep where I say, and you will play the part of the ghost until I find out who sent you." Callista looked at the heavy locks on the door and the shadow of the bodyguard through the frosted glass. The walls of the mansion seemed to shrink, the luxury turning into a gilded cage. She wasn't just Callista Varelli anymore. She was a piece of property owned by a man who didn't believe in mercy. She was a prisoner of the Santoro name, and the sentence was indefinite. The dining hall was an expanse of polished mahogany and cold silver, a room built for kings who expected to be betrayed. At the head of the table sat Orsino, his transformation jarring. Gone was the trembling man from the gala. In his place was a patriarch revitalized, his eyes bright with a feverish, misplaced joy. To his right, Callista sat trapped in the silk of her red dress, feeling less like a woman and more like a sacrificial lamb. "Eat, Elena," Orsino urged, his voice thick with an affection that made Callista's skin crawl with guilt. He placed a hand over hers, his grip possessive and warm. "You always loved the saltimbocca. I told the chef you'd be home tonight. He didn't believe me. No one did." Across the table, Zephyr sat in total silence. He hadn't touched his wine. His hand rested against his chin, his forefinger tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against his jawline. He wasn't eating. He was hunting. Every time Callista lifted her fork, every time she blinked, his intense gaze followed the movement, looking for the crack in her armor, the moment the ghost would reveal herself to be a fraud. "You're quiet tonight, Cara," Orsino remarked, his brow furrowing slightly. The air in the room thickened. This was the cliff's edge Zephyr had been waiting for. "I'm just overwhelmed, Orsino," Callista replied, her voice soft, carefully treading the line between mystery and truth. "It has been a very long time." Zephyr's eyes narrowed, a flash of predatory interest sparking in the dark irises. "A very long time indeed," he interjected, his voice a low melodic threat. "Tell me, Mother, Do you find the house changed? Or does everything feel exactly as you left it 20 years ago? The trap was laid. One wrong detail about the layout, one slip about a memory she couldn't possibly possess. And the dinner would end in blood. Callista looked from the hopeful, desperate eyes of the father to the lethal, calculating stare of the son. She realized then that she wasn't just playing a role to keep an old man sane. She was performing for her life. "The house is the same, Zephyr," Callista said, looking him directly in the eye, refusing to flinch. "It's the people in it who have grown cold." Orsino let out a booming, delighted laugh, clapping his hands together. "Exactly. She always saw right through you, boy." Zephyr didn't laugh. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He hadn't caught her yet, but as the shadows of the chandeliers lengthened against the wood-paneled walls, Callista knew he wouldn't stop until he tore the truth from her throat. She was playing the ghost, but in this house, ghosts were the only ones who knew where the bodies were buried. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the breakfast nook, but it brought no warmth to the Santoro estate. Callista sat across from Orsino, who was busily spreading jam on toast, his movements jerky and energetic. Zephyr had already vanished into the bowels of the house, leaving behind a silence that felt like a held breath. As Callista reached for a crystal carafe of orange juice, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She looked up, expecting to see Zephyr's shadow, but instead she saw the maid. The woman was standing perfectly still by the sideboard, her hands folded over a white apron. She wasn't polishing silver. She was staring at Orsino's mouth, her head tilted slightly as if trying to catch the frequency of a distant radio station. "The garden is looking peaked, Elena," Orsino murmured, leaning closer to Callista. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The frost hit the roses, but the roots are still deep. Remember what we buried under the stone bench in '98? Before Callista could respond, a footman appeared from behind a pillar. He didn't offer more coffee. He simply stood 3 feet away, his eyes fixed on Orsino with an alert, clinical seriousness that had nothing to do with hospitality. Callista's blood ran cold. She scanned the room and realized the pattern. Though the bodyguard at the door wasn't watching for intruders, he was watching Orsino. The maid wasn't waiting for a mess. She was recording a transcript. Every tremor in the old man's voice, every fragmented memory he tossed toward Callista, was being harvested. "Orsino," Callista said, her voice a sharp note that broke the heavy air. The staff didn't flinch, but their eyes shifted to her in a synchronized, predatory blink. "Perhaps we should walk in the garden, since you're so worried about the roots." Orsino smiled, but his eyes darted toward the footman. For a fleeting second, the fog of his dementia cleared, replaced by a look of profound, calculated terror. He squeezed Callista's hand, not with the affection of a husband, but with the frantic grip of a man drowning in plain sight. She looked toward the doorway and saw Zephyr standing in the shadows of the hall, his hand on his chin, watching the watchers. He wasn't the only one interrogating her anymore. The entire house was a living, breathing surveillance network, and she realized Orsino wasn't just a beloved patriarch. He was a prisoner in his own palace, and the staff were his jailers. In that moment, Callista understood Orsino didn't need a wife. He needed a courier, and she was the only one in the room who wasn't on the payroll. The afternoon sun was sinking, casting long skeletal shadows across the library's polished wooden walls. Orsino sat in his winged back chair, a heavy wool blanket draped over his knees despite the warmth of the room. He looked older today, his silver hair catching the dim light, but his eyes were unnervingly sharp. "Do you remember the conservatory we planned, Elena?" he asked, his voice a raspy lilt that echoed in the vast, quiet space. "The one where you wanted only the rarest blooms." Callista sat on the ottoman at his feet, aware of the heavy presence of the bodyguard by the door and the soft scuff of a maid's shoes in the hallway. Zephyr was somewhere in the house, a silent ghost behind the security monitors, listening. "I remember," Callista whispered, playing the part. Orsino leaned in, his face inches from hers. "We had to be so careful with the soil," he murmured, his eyes darting toward the bookshelves as if checking for hidden ears. "First, we planted the blue hydrangea. 10 million seeds, moved in the spring of 14. Then came the silver fern in Geneva, a stubborn thing. It required 3 separate transfers of light before it would take root." Callista's breath hitched. She watched his weathered hands move in the air, tracing invisible patterns. Blue hydrangea, silver fern. These weren't flowers. She had spent years working in high-end logistics. She knew the syntax of shell companies and offshore havens when she heard it. "The black orchid was the most beautiful," Orsino continued, his voice dropping to a low melodic hum, almost like a lullaby. "But it was thirsty. It drank from the main Santoro well until the well started to run dry last October. My father always said, 'Never let the gardener watch the black orchid, or he'll start to think the garden belongs to him.'" Callista felt a cold shiver race down her spine. Orsino wasn't reminiscing, he was auditing. And he was telling her exactly where the family's wealth had been diverted and who had been doing the diverting. The gardener. Across the room, the bodyguard shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. Orsino immediately slumped back, his expression dissolving into a vacant, dreamy smile. "But the lilies? The lilies were always your favorite, weren't they?" Callista nodded slowly, her mind racing to memorize the names and the dates. She looked up and saw the reflection in the library's glass cases. Zephyr was standing in the doorway, his hand on his chin, his intense expression unreadable. He had heard the lullaby, but did he understand the music? Or was he too busy watching the ghost to notice the house was being robbed blind? She realized then that Orsino had chosen her because she was the only one Zephyr wouldn't suspect of being a bookkeeper. She wasn't just his wife, she was his vault. The moon hung low over the Santoro estate, bleeding pale light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sunroom. Orsino had finally drifted into a shallow sleep in his chair, his hand still loosely clutching Callista's. Before he had succumbed to exhaustion, he had pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you for staying, Elena. I know it's dark here. I know I'm a hard man to love." The sheer, crushing weight of his loneliness had finally cracked the shell Callista had spent years building. She had sat with the dying and the broken before, but never with a king who was being eaten alive by his own court. She stepped away from the sleeping patriarch, retreating into the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. The tears came silently at first, then in jagged, shuddering breaths that she tried to stifle against her palm. She wasn't crying because she was a prisoner. She was crying because Orsino's heart was the only real thing in a house built of lies. "The performance is over, Callista. You can stop now." The voice was like a shard of ice. Callista spun around, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Zephyr was standing by a marble bust, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He moved toward her, his pace slow and deliberate, his hand dropping from his chin as he stepped into the light. He looked at her wet cheeks, his brow furrowing in a rare moment of genuine disorientation. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Is this part of the script? The grieving widow? The empathetic saint?" "It's not a script, Zephyr," Callista spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Your father is terrified. He's surrounded by people who are waiting for him to stop breathing so they can carve up what's left of him. And you, his own son, are so busy looking for a knife in my hand that you can't see he's the one bleeding out." Zephyr stopped inches from her. The usual mask of lethal indifference flickered. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on her cheek. The touch was startlingly warm, a brief spark of humanity that felt like a betrayal of his nature. For a second, the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a raw, searching look. A man trying to remember what it felt like to believe someone. "You aren't acting," he murmured, the realization moving through him like a physical blow. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his expression instantly hardening back into a wall of granite. The ice had broken, but the water underneath was deeper and more dangerous than she had imagined. "That makes you even more dangerous," he whispered, his voice regaining its sharp edge. "Because if you actually care about him, you'll stay. And if you stay, I'll never be sure if you're his salvation or the final distraction that gets us both killed." He turned on his heel, leaving her alone in the dark. He didn't trust her, but for the first time, he wasn't looking at her like a con artist. He was looking at her like a variable he couldn't control. The tea service arrived at exactly 4 p.m., carried on a silver tray by the head footman, Marcello. The porcelain was delicate, painted with gold leaf that shimmered under the library's dim chandeliers. Beside the steaming pot sat a small amber vial. It was a routine Callista had observed for 3 days, the vitamins meant to steady the chairman's nerves. "Time for your strength, sir," Marcello said, his voice a smooth, professional hum. He began to unscrew the cap with practiced ease. Orsino sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the window, his mind clearly drifting back toward the fog. He reached out a trembling hand, a submissive, habitual gesture that made Callista's pulse spike. She noticed the way Marcello's eyes darted toward the hallway where the family's consigliere stood in the shadows, watching with a faint, tight-lipped smile. As Marcello tilted the vial over the cup, Callista moved. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. She reached out and tipped the tray, sending the porcelain cup clattering onto the thick Persian rug. The tea soaked into the wool, steaming and dark. "Elena!" Orsino gasped, startled back into the present. The temperature in the room plummeted. Marcello froze, his face a mask of insulted professionalism. But Callista saw the flicker of genuine panic in his pupils. From the doorway, the consigliere stepped into the light, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "Is there a problem, Miss Varelli?" the consigliere asked, his voice dripping with a lethal kind of concern. "It was too hot," Callista lied, her eyes locked on the amber vial still clutched in Marcello's hand. "And Orsino has had enough vitamins today. He's been very sharp this afternoon. I won't have him dulled." She looked down at the soaked rug where the tea had pooled. She noticed a faint, metallic sheen, a chemical, iridescent film that didn't belong in Earl Grey. She looked up and met the consigliere's gaze. He didn't look angry. He looked at her with the calculating coldness of a man who had just identified a loose thread that needed to be burned. In that silence, Callista finally saw the gardener. It wasn't the low-level staff or a rival family. It was the man who had managed the Santoro books for 30 years, the man now standing 5 feet away, realizing that the ghost could see right through him. Zephyr appeared in the doorway behind the consigliere, his hand on his chin, his intense gaze taking in the shattered porcelain and the spilled tea. He looked at the consigliere, then at Callista. He didn't say a word, but the suspicious tilt of his head told her he had noticed the vial. The battle lines were no longer invisible. Callista had just knocked the cup from the trader's hand, and she knew the next time he offered her something, it wouldn't be tea. The library air was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of the spilled tea. Callista stood her ground as Zephyr dismissed the staff with a sharp jerk of his head. The doors clicked shut, leaving them in a silence so heavy it felt pressurized. Zephyr moved toward her, his shadow stretching across the mahogany floorboards until it swallowed the red silk of her dress. "You're making quite a mess of my house, Callista," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "First my father's mind, and now his medicine. Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you removed right now." "Because your medicine is a sedative, Zephyr," she snapped, stepping closer until she was within the circle of his heat. "And your consigliere isn't a gardener. He's a parasite. Orsino isn't just reminiscing. He's been talking to me in code." Zephyr's hand dropped from his chin, his brow furrowing. "Code?" "The flowers," Callista whispered, her eyes darting toward the security cameras she now knew were compromised. "Blue hydrangea, silver fern, black orchid. They aren't blooms, Zephyr. They're shell companies. 10 million in the hydrangea account, moved in 2014. The orchid is the Santoro main fund, and it's been leaking into the consigliere's pockets since last October." Zephyr went perfectly still. The skepticism in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, analytical fire. He was a man of numbers and blood. Suddenly, the numbers were starting to bleed. "My father told you this?" "He's been trying to tell you," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the secret. "But you were too busy looking at me to listen to him." The revelation hung between them for a heartbeat, a bridge of truth built in a house of lies. For the first time, Zephyr's expression wasn't just suspicious, it was unguarded. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve as if trying to ground himself in this new reality. Then the world shattered. A muffled thud echoed from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. Zephyr's instincts kicked in before the first pane of glass exploded. He tackled Callista, his heavy frame shielding her as a hail of bullets shredded the leather armchairs and pulverized the marble bust behind them. "Down!" he roared over the deafening rhythm of suppressed gunfire. The library, once a sanctuary of history, became a kill zone. Red silk dragged through the dust and splinters as Zephyr dragged her behind the heavy mahogany desk. He pulled a sleek black pistol from his waistband, his face shifting into a mask of pure, lethal intent. "They're not here for the old man anymore," Zephyr hissed, checking his magazine while the doors groaned under the weight of a ram. He looked at Callista, his intense eyes locking onto hers amidst the chaos. "They're here for the only two people who know the code." In the flickering light of the dying chandeliers, the Mafia boss and the stranger shared a final desperate realization. The coup had begun, and the only way out was through the men who had once been their protectors. The smoke from the gunfire curled around the library's chandeliers like a funeral shroud. Zephyr didn't wait for the doors to give way. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a man born to rule the dark. He hauled Callista to her feet, his grip on her arm unyielding. "Orsino?" she gasped, her red dress torn at the hem, stained with the dust of the Santoro legacy. "We have to get to Orsino." "I know," Zephyr rasped. For the first time, he didn't lead her as a prisoner, but as a partner. They moved through the servant passages, the hidden veins of the house that the traitors thought they controlled. When they burst into the patriarch's bedroom, the scene was already at its breaking point. The consigliere stood over Orsino's bed, a silencer aimed at the old man's heart. Orsino looked up, his eyes clear, his face set in a mask of regal defiance. He wasn't a victim. He was a king waiting for his knight. "Drop it!" Zephyr's voice rang out, a low tectonic rumble. The consigliere spun, but he was too slow. Zephyr didn't hesitate. A single shot echoed through the room, and the traitor, who had bled the family dry, fell in a heap of expensive wool and cheap ambition. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the window panes. Zephyr holstered his weapon and turned to his father. Orsino didn't look at his son. He looked at Callista. He reached out a trembling hand, and this time Callista took it without fear. "The garden is safe now, Elena," the old man whispered, his voice soft and weary. "The roots are deep." Orsino's eyes drifted shut, his breathing finally falling into the steady rhythm of a man who no longer had to carry a secret. Zephyr stood over them, his hand returning to his chin, but the suspicion was gone. He looked at Callista, really looked at her, past the red dress, past the resemblance to a dead woman, and saw the only person in his world who had asked for nothing and given everything. "The staff is being purged," Zephyr said, his voice regaining its sharp, tailored edge, but it softened as he stepped closer to her. "The accounts are being frozen. My father will have the best care, and the consigliere's name will be erased by dawn." He paused, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "Everyone in this city will want to know who the woman in red is. They'll want to know how a stranger took down a 30-year coup." "What will you tell them?" Callista asked, her voice steady. Zephyr reached out, his fingers grazing her jaw, his touch no longer a threat, but a promise. "I'll tell them that ghosts don't exist," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her lip. "But the new Santoro does, and she's the only one I trust to keep the keys to the kingdom." In the cold gray light of the approaching morning, the stranger and the boss stood together. The deception was over. The war was won, and in a house built on blood, a new unbreakable truth had finally taken root. Thank you for staying till the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel.